We've all survived the first week of the Biden administration. There have been highs and controversies already, and as is customary, the first 100 days of any president's term merit a pretty heavy scrutiny. Here at the Dry Club, we thought we'd throw in some scrutiny of our own. I'm Josh Bagley.
I'm Brian Henderson.
And I'm Mario Mascaro.
Welcome to the Dry Club, where we put nuance back in the news. This episode will be an analysis of the Biden administration's first 100 days domestic policy agenda, or at least what we expect it to be. We'll cover foreign policy in our regular video next week. So I want to start this really with COVID-19. So I'll throw this to Hendo first. Do you expect the vaccine rollout to go well under the Biden administration? And what do you expect? How well do you expect it to go?
I think that it will likely go. Will it go 100% according to plan? Okay, let's see. His plan is to roll out 100 million vaccines in 100 days. And to put that in a little bit of contextual comparison, the Trump administration, according to what was it, Operation Warp Speed, I think it was what it was called.
Yes, Warp Speed.
They had planned to do a total of 20 million initial shots by the end of December. And when did the vaccine come out? Like late November or something like that, or early November?
Early December.
And they ended up only vaccinating roughly 2.8, or we'll say about 3 million individuals. So do I think that the Biden administration is going to be able to, vaccinate or give out 100 million shots in 100 days? No. No. I think that they're going to do a lot better than the Trump administration, but I think that's going to be in large part due to production has already been rolling. Vaccines have been shipped to the states and local communities, and where the shots are meeting the arms, et cetera, they're going to get better at that. I don't think that they're going to meet that goal, though. It's going to be better, but
there's a particular point of interest that we should consider here, which is that we have a live action test case for examining this question when we consider the way and the mechanisms for the testing regimen that existed in this country, right? So we had an absolutely enormous number of testing, something like 125 million people tested over the course of the previous 12 months. And the difficulty is that those tests were enormously difficult to organize, enormously difficult to actually execute. And that was, again, over the course of 12 months. We now have to consider the fact that we're talking about vaccinating at least first doses for something like 100 million individuals. And there's a real question about whether, given the experience of the previous 12 months, whether something like that is even feasible. Whether or not it's purely aspirational.
So I think that I see where you're coming from, Mario. I know from experience that there were lulls in that period as well, right? So there were times where they weren't processing as many tests. There were times where I showed up to our local state-run testing site and there was nobody in line. I immediately jumped to the front of the line. But I think we're sort of missing the target here a little bit. One thing that I want to mention, I think that the first 100 million are going to be easy. I think the first 150 million are going to be easy. So I interviewed a guy yesterday for employment, and we were talking about mask wearing on the job and the vaccine. And he said, well, I'm going to get the vaccine, but I'm going to be one of the last to get the vaccine. And I know my father has intimated a similar sort of opinion. So I see the first 150 million being very easily administered. I see the second 100 million having to sort of be drugged and sort of pushed out to go get the vaccine. I see the final 80 million straight up not taking it. And that's where I think we're at with sort of the societal breakdown piece of it, which neither of you guys really hit on. I think that, like I said, the first 150 million are going to be easy to get shot into arms. People are crawling all over each other trying to get it. I think the second 100 million are going to be tough to sort of drag out to the administration stations. I think the last 80 million just aren't going to take it.
Okay, I may have misunderstood the question. So, but I guess to bounce back, do you think that under the Biden administration's leadership? Oh, I thought you were talking about his specific plan for, his 100 million vaccinations in 100 days. Do you think that the United States is going to be able to, succeed in that under the Biden administration's leadership? 100 million new vaccinations in 100 days.
100 days takes us out to what, the end of, or roughly mid-April? I think April 14th. 100 days would take us to. I think that's definitely feasible, especially at the rate we're vaccinating people already, plus the additional orders that we've already put in for more doses of the vaccine. I think the issue is going to be getting people out to take the vaccine. I think that's where the administration is going to run into problems. I think they're going to have to request additional funding from Congress and legislation, we'll talk about that later, to divert towards an ad campaign to bring people out to get the vaccine. I fully expect. Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry, well, no, I was only going to say that I definitely agree with that it's going to be difficult to, get out to vaccine, get out to vote, get out to vaccine, whatever. Vaccinate, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Mario, do you have anything to add to this sort of societal perspective on the vaccine take?
I think you're right. Both of you are right to distinguish the legal and the administrative difficulties associated with administering a vaccine from the societal one. And it is clear that there is a contingent of the population who have no interest, either because they don't believe in sort of a traditional medical establishment, or for whatever other reason, will refuse to have a vaccine. And I think there are clear and obvious disadvantages that will come from having a population that rejects medical science. I'm sorry if that sounds offensive, but there is a problem, it seems to me, with having I think the number that you projected was 80 million. But even if it's less than that, right, 50 million people in the a country of 380 or 400 million people, having that number of people who think that the vaccination is unnecessary or ineffective is really a huge problem in terms of producing the kinds of herd immunity that are necessary to keep people safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So across the country, we're seeing states reopen at a pretty sophisticated and relatively quick rate. I know Illinois just essentially reopened the entire state for pretty much everything, and I know California has reopened significantly in the last week or so to really a lot of the question of a lot of the populace. So with all that being said, does the current state of the economy, with states reopening and the vaccines in the early stages of the rollout, does this necessitate another stimulus check? And Mario, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, this is actually an enormously interesting question, because I think there's really a couple of different elements which contribute to this conversation. And obviously the stimulus check is a big part of this. But I think it's important to understand that reopening the economy is not just contingent necessarily on the degree of vaccination, the participation in vaccination, but really a more comprehensive conversation about the participation in COVID policies, things like masking. So I think we may see in many areas an enormous impetus to open the economy, to reopen businesses, to reopen manufacturing, et cetera, in order to inject that kind of stimulus into the economy. I think there is absolutely an enormous priority to use the stimulus to inject that bottom-up funding to individuals to help them pay bills, buy whatever it is they may need. I think that's absolutely an essential thing that we may see in this next 100 days.
What about you, Brian?
Yeah,
Do you think that another stimulus check is necessary given how the economy is quickly reopening?
I wouldn't say that it's necessary, but I definitely agree that it's it's worthwhile to pursue, and it would help out a lot. I mean, we're still seeing, I think, this last week, the job numbers that came in were 900,000 initial applications, filings for that initial application for unemployment benefits, and the week before that was a little over 900,000, and the week before that was nearly 900,000. I mean, we're still looking at pretty significant job loss, even basically a year after the pandemic has started. The economy in the fourth quarter, the final quarter of 2020, only increased by 1 percentage point. I do think that those stimulus checks should happen. I don't necessarily think that they're needed, but they should happen. The United States economy and the United States people have obviously suffered a great deal this year.
So it's interesting that you make that specific point, because it occurs to me that as these conversations about the impact of COVID are going on, they tend to focus almost exclusively on the macro level impact that has been produced on large businesses and national figures, etc. And I think it is absolutely critical to understand the relationship between the ability of the individual at the lowest conceivable level to pay their bills and the success, the health of the economy more broadly. And I think it's absolutely the case that creating another stimulus, or indeed, as it may potentially be, multiple stimulus opportunities, stimulus checks, would produce a very successful outcome for the economy more broadly, and all of the economic figures which are more commonly discussed when these issues come up.
Yeah, so as a Keynesian myself, I'm a person who favors UBI very generally, and so I like seeing this. I like seeing the stimulus money and sort of its experiment with how well it keeps people afloat. But I want to pivot this to a more drilled down question before we move on, and that's that: does this need to be a hard copy check / direct deposit, or could this work as a tax rebate?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I think there is a real argument to be made for actual money in people's pockets and not just a tax rebate. I think there is a real argument to be made for that in terms of actual production, actual value bubbling up from the lowest level to the upper level of the economy. I can imagine a similar kind of effect being produced from a tax rebate, but I think there is a clear and obvious conclusion made by some that tax benefit produced much later may not produce the kinds of immediate stimulus and measurable stimulus that we may see if we are using a more direct method that you're describing. So I think if anything else, for administrative reasons, there's a reason to produce these more direct checks, this more direct injection of funds, in order to have a more measurable outcome later on.
And so I bring the tax rebate question up specifically to sort of segue us into the legislative agenda of the Biden administration in the first 100 days, because I think a tax rebate would be much more likely to garner the necessary votes in the Senate in particular than a stimulus check would be. But more broadly speaking, and I'll throw this one to Hendo to start, Will Biden have any sort of success reaching across the aisle? I know he talked a lot about bipartisanship and unity in his campaign, and he touted his relationship with Minority Leader McConnell. He touted his longstanding relationships with a lot of Republicans in the Senate, with his 36 years in the Senate. Do you think he will have success reaching across the aisle and building not necessarily broad coalitions, but coalitions nonetheless? Because right now it seems that Joe Manchin holds 100% of the power in the Senate. Do you anticipate Biden having any sort of success building a coalition around Joe Manchin potentially, or with additional Republicans to garner the 60 vote threshold so we don't have to pass things either in reconciliation or by eliminating the filibuster?
That's a complicated question. I think
Really
that
is.
yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking about the initial 100 days and we're still on the COVID relief packages, yeah, I think that he could definitely garner a coalition that includes, a pretty substantial amount of Republicans who have already voiced their opinion, have already voiced support for, the 200,000, the $2,000 stimulus checks, right? Like I think it was Josh Hawley and anyway.
But that was pre-January 6th.
No.
Do you think their opinions change?
No, I don't think their opinions change, but their opinions, I think they're objecting to this new proposal because there's a lot more in it other than, an additional $1,400 per person going to Americans. There's a lot of stuff. There's a proposal for a federal minimum wage increase. There's a lot of money for states and local governments. There's a lot more stuff in there than just $1,400. And some, even Manchin, I think he was one of the people who expressed concerns over these stimulus checks having the potential to going to pretty wealthy families who make over $300,000 per year. So if you can eliminate some of that, yeah, I think you can definitely get a coalition. But I mean, some of the more difficult things,
I am really
require reconciliation.
I am really tempted to begin to have a conversation about the policy more broadly. But it seems to me there is a pretty significant problem that we're going to see just in this first 100 days as the Democratic Party tries to come to grips with the mechanisms they are going to use in interacting with the minority party. And what we are seeing is there is not a unified system, a unified consensus about how they're going to interact with the minority party, whether they're going to attempt bipartisanship in all cases, in some cases, or indeed, as it may be, in no cases. And I think there is a real conversation to be had about what the nature of bipartisanship should mean, whether we should expect to see a greater degree of, for example, accountability for previous actions, right? The Senate trial going on right now, considering whether or not Donald Trump could reasonably be accused of having incited the January 6th riots, would be an example of the kind of discontinuity which seems to exist between the minority party and the Democrats. So I think we have to be very cautious in understanding that, in particular, the Republican Party is not monolithic in the way that it considers bipartisanship, in the way that it imagines the kinds of concessions that will have to be offered in order to make deals with the majority party.
Okay. So moving to the specific pieces of legislation, because I know we talked. Brian touched on them very briefly. So we know that President Biden has already got an immigration reform bill that's on its way over to the Senate. Immigration reform is something that a bipartisan group of senators, the Gang of Eight, have been working on for quite some time now. That includes my senior senator, Dick Durbin, among others. I believe John McCain was the Republican that led that push for a while prior to his untimely death. But I'm aware that the group is still together. So do you think that we'll be able to push immigration reform through? I don't know that it'll be in the first 100 days, but it's obviously going to hit Biden's proposal is going to hit the Senate in the first 100 days. So I think it's important to really discuss the destination and the future of immigration reform, at least in a very general sense. Mario?
I think it's very difficult to talk about immigration reform in sort of an abstract sense, because some of the individual components of the legislation are variously acceptable to certain legislators, and we see in previous attempts to try and enact this kind of legislation that specific legislators who would otherwise be necessary to create consensus have specific reasons or specific elements of their constituencies that are opposed to individual elements. And the difficulty with immigration reform more broadly is it requires very little to create opposition, in the sense that anyone with even a minority or a tiny excuse is able to generate enough support to vote no, making these kinds of policies very, very difficult to push forward.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with that. I mean, because it's not a spending bill, revenue, taxes, all that jazz. So it can't, from what I understand, right, it cannot be pushed forward through reconciliation. So it's going to take a supermajority.
So the latest readout I've heard from the Senate parliamentarian is that the $15 minimum wage will have to be stricken from the COVID bill in order to push the COVID bill through as well. So with that being said, I don't think there's a question that President Biden will not be able to put. I don't think he will be able to push through a $15 minimum wage in the first 100 days or the first 2 years of his presidency. Do you guys think he'll be able to push any sort of minimum wage increase through? Because I think there's an appetite for a minimum wage increase if he does it at a smaller level. I think if he made it a minimum wage increase to $10, I think he can get some biters from some moderate Republicans that would allow him to clear the 60 vote threshold. And I'm interested to hear you guys' thoughts on that.
I think there's a real problem that is outlined by what you're describing. I think that we need to come to terms with the fact that the Republican minority in the Senate represents a bewilderingly few number of people because of the nature of the Senate, and as a consequence, the majority of people, as represented by the Senate, are absolutely in favor of raising the federal minimum wage higher. Whether that necessarily be $15, I think that's an open question which can be discussed. But there clearly is a movement on the Democratic side to see that number raised. Where it becomes difficult is to get buy-in from those smaller in terms of population states, to see those individual senators see that as an important thing, and whether that can be successfully translated into some sort of legislative success. But I don't think that's something that we're likely to see divorced from some other kind of deal made between the majority and the minority party in the Senate.
No.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. That's going to be a tough bill to pass. Yeah.
It's going to be a really tough bill to pass. And you guys know me. I'm generally not a fan of the minimum wage in its current form anyway. And we can do a deep dive on the minimum wage at some other point if you guys want to. I wrote a pretty hefty paper in undergrad about the minimum wage. I'm a big advocate for an alternative minimum. But in any case, yeah, I don't think he's going to be able to push through a minimum wage increase
Sorry, Josh.
at any point.
What is the alternative minimum?
So the system that I've seen and sort of what I tried to model off of is a system that tiers the minimum wage based on the company's net revenue.
Okay.
And so, or essentially your EBITDA. So taking and tiering what your company's minimum wage is based on your EBITDA allows smaller companies to compete against larger ones, and it doesn't create the price floor necessarily that prices smaller companies out of business because larger companies can afford to take a greater hit.
How do you avoid large companies from just compartmentalizing their workers in such a way that they are able to completely divert the problem the ceiling that you're describing?
So that's why I think EBITDA is so important, because if we were to take it off of net, your bottom line net, where so many companies are able to skirt taxes, then I think you're correct. We don't have the ability to control that. But if we take it off of their EBITDA, their earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, that gives us a better idea of what the company is actually making prior to them starting that deduction process for the taxes.
Yeah, no, you've completely misunderstood my question, and I think that's my fault. But what I mean is, if I were a Fortune 500 company trying to avoid paying my workers the minimum wage,
why would you do that?
What I would do is I would create a company exclusively for the purpose of contracting my workers, and that company would have no revenue, but would only be a pass-through to allow me to pay my workers for the rest of the corporation. And do you have some mechanism in your proposal which would prevent me from just manipulating my infrastructure, my financial infrastructure, in such a way that I would be able to find the minimum threshold to pay my workers?
Wow, no, I hadn't built that into the model. I'm going to be frank.
I didn't invent that. I wish I was that clever, but I did not invent that strategy. So what I just described is actually the strategy that is most commonly used with long-term care facilities, where they will create institutions to perform each individual's function. So they'll have like a company that just does the laundry and a company that just hires the nurses, etc. And that allows them to diversify their liability and protect them in cases of lawsuits. And I'm concerned that the kind of strategy that you are suggesting is too easily manipulated by the kinds of companies that are inclined to organize themselves to pay no tax to begin with.
That may be true.
I think that's a fair pushback. So in that case, yeah, it would have to contain some sort of regulatory addition that prescribed to how we discern the profits that an individual company faces. But in any case, we're on a little bit of a tangent now. We will do a deep dive on the minimum wage at some point whenever the news runs dry, which I'm sure will happen given that we're now in a Biden administration, and we can do some of these deep dives that we want to do on the minimum wage or UBI or monetary policy or what have you, which are all things that I want to do. So I want to hit one more legislative agenda question, and this is sort of out of left field. But this week, Senator Warren introduced a bill for D.C. statehood. What do you guys think is the likelihood of D.C. and Puerto Rican statehood? And as a follow-on question to that, are there some Republicans that could compromise if D.C. statehood and Puerto Rican statehood were packaged together? And the reason I ask that question in that way is because Puerto Rico's current sole representative to Congress, which is a non-voting representative, is a Republican. So there's a case to be made possibly for Republicans to be amenable to that. if DC and Puerto Rico are both included in the statehood proposal.
Hendo, I'm happy for you to take first bite of this question.
Do I see what's the likelihood of DC becoming a state? I mean, so are there any other? I'd have to brush up on my statehood law or procedures, but are there any other requirements outside of the two houses of Congress? Does it, like, so when it's coming from DC, if Senator Warren just introduces that piece of legislation and the citizens of DC, imagine a scenario for a second that most of the citizens of the people living in DC don't want statehood, say like 90% of them, but Senator Warren introduces that legislation in the Senate, right? She it has to pass the filibuster, and it's probably just a simple majority in the House. But isn't that a little interesting, though? Are there any other stipulations? Does it have to go through their local government? How does that process work? I'm actually,
there will be a local referendum that's been that is taken, but that referendum has already been done in both DC and Puerto Rico.
Has it been done in Puerto Rico?
DC broadly. Yes, it has. DC broadly elected to join. Puerto Rico was significantly more narrow, but it was in favor.
Okay. So I mean, the chances of it. I mean, gosh, I don't know. I don't want to give it would be a complete guess, like a very uneducated guess. And when it comes to both of those, DC and Puerto Rico, I mean, I really don't see it happening outside of, eliminating a filibuster rule. That's what I would guess. Yeah.
All right, Mario?
So the only thing that I would contribute to, in addition to what Hendo's already added to this, is I think we really need to develop a coherent strategy, whether we say, look, we are in favor of maintaining the system, the mechanisms of the Senate as they exist now.
Who's we?
Or the three of us, apart from anyone else. But we need to figure out whether that's the appropriate strategy, or to say, look, there is a real problem tying representation to land mass and not to population. And quite frankly, my own response is, I think there is a real problem with the way that we are currently allocating representation in the Senate. And I think that really is the primary issue. I am happy, apart from anything else, I'm happy to see DC and Puerto Rico achieve statehood completely independent of this question of representation. But I think it separately introduces a more important political question that I think needs to be addressed.
Agree with the need to address the proportional representation issues in the Senate. I don't know that will ever occur. I mean, the founders structured that, and we're all aware of why they structured it. They structured it to preserve the Old South, who otherwise would not have the appropriate amount of representation to preserve slavery from 1789 to 1860,
and also to create the actual country. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. Again, I of all people,
there are obviously very bad the founders, things, but it's involved in those negotiations.
It's important to understand that the system, as it was designed, was intended to obstruct progressive change. That was the entire point of the system. And so it is important for us to understand the connection between these kinds of legacy institutions and if we're being completely honest, more backwards performance of our legislators over the past 2 decades. Only would see those two things as being coincidental.
And in some cases, that prevention of progress has been a good thing within U.S. history. But the way the Senate was designed is not in the way that the houses are designed to interact with one another are not necessarily bad. And I recognize we're getting off on another tangent, but
Political
the
theory.
design of the Senate in particular, in the way that the states are represented in the Senate, was built specifically to preserve slavery. That
Yeah.
was the key methodology behind two senators from each state, because no other bicameral legislature does it like this. Their upper chamber for every other bicameral legislature is not built with representation by landmass.
Yeah, and nor should it be. And so it's, again, this is my comprehensive argument that I'm going to apply not just to this conversation but to all of them is we as a society
All of them.
need to decide how we want this to be organized. How is it an effective system to have our representation decided in this way? Do we agree that that's what we want? If it is, fine. If not, we need to, it forces us to have a much more meaningful conversation about how to execute that representation.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Okay, so I want to pivot to our final topic, which is going to be executive orders and sort of the highlights. Before I do that, I want to mention that Brian and I are both drinking Dead Guy by Rogue tonight. I'm drinking out of my Hops Rogue glass that no longer exists. I've got the can right here behind me. If you own a small brewery and would like to have your beer featured on our channel, all you need to do is send us 18 beers, 6 per person, and we will happily feature it on the channel.
That's a great idea.
I know, right? I just thought of that. But I wanted to highlight the beer we were drinking.
If you only get 18 beers, what will the two of you drink?
I guess we'll have to buy our own.
So,
Jeez.
Moving into our final topic of the executive orders of the Biden administration. So there's been a lot of news coverage on this in weird sort of segmented ways. Executive orders, a lot of them are normal for the beginning of a presidential administration, and a lot of executive orders are either continuations of policies that have been in existence for decades, like the information security policy, Executive Order 12333, that has to be re-signed by each additional president, as well as the intelligence oversight is 13333. Information security is 12356 or something like that. But a lot of those executive orders are signed as continuation executive orders. There are also executive orders that suspend policies for review, so they're not necessarily completely overturning the policy. They're just suspending it pending review. President Biden signed one like that yesterday, where President Trump had signed an executive order that brought down the cost of certain drugs like insulin and penicillin. Yesterday, President Biden put that under a 60-day review via executive order. A couple of other things have been done by executive order like that, but some are meant to reverse regular day-to-day policies by the previous executive. So I want to go, and I'm going to start this with you, Mario, and then I'm going to go to Hendo, and then I'll touch off on mine. What are some highlights for you for the executive orders that President Biden has signed that were meaningful within the last week?
Yeah, so there's two key ones that I think are really important. The first one that I would highlight would be the requirement for DHS and other institutions to effectively address the family separation policy of the previous administration and to effectively connect or reconnect those separated children with their families. I think that's an absolutely essential thing and frankly, long overdue. So hopefully over the course of the next 6 months, we see some sort of a really effective way of addressing that issue from the previous administration and bringing that together. The other specific one that I would bring up would be the EO that was designed to remove the prohibition for transgender individuals from serving in the military. There is a basic, my own view on this. Obviously, the three of us being veterans have our own policy on this, but it seems to me that there is a real obvious point to be made that we should be discriminating on the basis of ability and merit, and not on other arbitrary capacities that are divined for purely partisan or political reasons. So, speaking only for myself, I strongly support any policy that removes these kinds of arbitrary military restrictions.
Yeah.
I think Secretary Mattis supports that, or former Secretary Mattis supports that one as well. And anything that Mattis supports, I think the majority of the military joins him in supporting.
Hear, hear.
Because he is amongst himself. What about you, Hendo? Highlights from the executive orders.
Well, I would say his the executive order that reversed a previous executive order, which was which I guess the title is called Protecting the Nation from, the previous executive order was called Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. And it was essentially nicknamed the Muslim ban. And I think that was sort of antithetical to, the ideals of the United States, and for a lot of other practical reasons as well. It wasn't really including a lot of countries that, are some of the main exporters of, terrorist organizations and terrorist activities and whatnot. It just had it's just not it was a bad policy. I mean, I think it was the opposite of leadership. It was not what the world needed at the time. It was also
racially good. Substantively based, because I mean, when you look at the countries who were denied entry, the country with the largest Muslim population in the world is Indonesia, and they were not barred entry.
Yeah.
It was very specific. It wasn't discriminatory. I don't think it was discriminatory based on religion as much as it was discriminatory based on race, because the countries that were targeted weren't necessarily the most Muslim countries in the world.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it was sort of like an incoherent. At least I interpret it as a very incoherent order. Yeah. So Mario stole my other one though. It was the executive order lifting the ban on trans people serving in the United States military. He stole mine. Thanks, Mario.
You're welcome.
Is that because you stole the mustache from the YMCA guy?
No, yeah.
That was the cowboy you're thinking of. Yeah, that was a.
Them.
It's a good one. Yeah, we're good friends.
Oh, geez. Yeah, I think that's completely ridiculous. But to address your point earlier, Mattis, I believe Mattis wrote like an op-ed, or it wasn't an op-ed. What was it? It was a memorandum, right? Just like
even worse than that. So Mattis wrote a specific memo on this question while he was still
in office, or while SecDef.
Yeah, he was still SecDef, and he wrote a policy saying this is dumb, discriminatory, and ineffective, and we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah,
and obviously because that was a reasonable policy, it was rejected out of hand by the ruling administration. So no great surprise there. But again, I think I'm happy for either of you to disagree with me if you think I've misstated this. But I think our perspectives as veterans really comes down to the kinds of policies that we should see really should be blind to these sort of partisan questions and should be focused exclusively on the real practical considerations of performance and not in any way tied to these other issues. So I'm really happy to see that these kinds of discriminatory bans are lifted, and the military allowed to have a more free hand in administering their own personnel.
Yeah, I agree. This one, the ban to me, it just didn't make sense. I mean, come on,
It didn't.
It just didn't make sense. I mean, I try to. I think I at least try to, view these things through a very, a charitable lens. And this one, I don't know. There's nothing there really. I mean, there's not much there. There's nothing there.
I am content
bad policy.
I'm content for both parties to play politics. I think that is the nature of the game. I think that there is a real red line that should be drawn around playing politics with the military.
Of course.
And I think that is a firm red line that both parties should observe.
Let's bring it up right now.
Yeah, and this policy was a clear violation of that.
The
that red line.
Speaker of the House. Okay, I might butcher this, but the Speaker of the House just a few weeks ago released a statement to the public that she was in communication with the Joint Chief of Staff with regard to nuclear codes and access to them and preventative measures that might be in place. I mean, that's clearly a a no-go in the realm of civil military relations. I mean, why you're putting this senior leader of the military in such a you're politicizing his statement. Whatever he said, he might not have said anything, whatever, right? I mean, you're politicizing that entire communication. I think that was horrible. I mean, there's been a lot of other horrible things like that in the past, especially in the last, like, say 3 or 4 years, but I mean, come on. Let's separate the fucking, or excuse me. let's separate, military and civilian interests.
Yeah, no, that was completely uncalled for by the speaker. I don't understand I understand what drove her to have that conversation. Yeah. I don't understand what drove her to make that statement.
Yeah, to be charitable, as I was just saying, I think that she was honestly very rattled. Or wait, actually, let me pause. Was that before or after January the 6th? So it was after. That was after
6th. January 6th.
Okay, so yeah, that is. So I would continue. Yeah. Yeah. So she was probably very rattled. Emotions running high for every single member of Congress who actually, took it seriously. Yeah. But hindsight being 2020, I don't think it's not good for civil military relations. But yeah.
No. All right.
What else remained on your agenda for this discussion?
That was the last thing on my agenda, was the executive orders.
All right. Well, I'll just conclude this one by saying that I am really excited to be able to examine further policy changes, whether they be legislative or executive orders that come through in the next 100 days. And next opportunity at the next podcast, we're going to make a specific emphasis on the foreign policy impacts of this first 100 days. And we thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks so much.
Oh, hey. Didn't see you there. Thanks for watching. No, this isn't another ASMR video, unfortunately. This is much more important. This is about whether or not you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, there is currently only one way for you to support this channel, and that is by subscribing, liking this video, and commenting down below. If you didn't enjoy this video, I'm sorry to hear that, but I really appreciate it that you've made it this far.